My name is Tuuli Toivonen, and I come from the University of Helsinki, from Finland. And the idea of me today would be to talking to you about social media data for conservation science and some of our research on that topic. I'm Associate Professor of Geoinformatics at the Department of Geosciences and Geography in the University of Helsinki, and I did my PhD originally on mapping biodiversity patterns on habitat scale and doing species distribution modeling and so on. But then after my PhD some 10 plus years ago, I sort of got intrigued more and more about human activities and trying to understand that what is actually the role of human in land use change, climate change, not that much more on land use change and biodiversity, threats for biodiversity and so on. And then moved even to urban environments to be studying urban mobilities and try to understand actually the mobilities of people and how do those influence different things, either in urban context or then in natural environments. And this project that we are now running and several related projects using social media data is sort of continuation of that work. There's a big group of people behind the work and within our lab, or big and big, you're many in here, and we're 13 or 15, depends how you count. But anyways, a multidisciplinary group with people from different backgrounds, or people of different backgrounds, geographers, conservation scientists, computer scientists, human geographers, cartographers, and so on, who have joined their forces somehow to be advancing what we consider is important. So to be creating tools and approaches, analysis that would be supporting spatial planning, spatial decision making, using novel data sources, using different types of digital data, using different types of analysis, and going from the spatial perspective also a bit to understanding what people are doing and so on through, for example, methods of machine learning and artificial intelligence that we now have been applying. Not sure if some of you know there's people who have conservation background like Endiko Diminin and Anna Hausman, Johanna Eklund, and then PhD students who are sort of clearly conservation scientists, and many of us are sort of one leg in conservation science and the other one somewhere in spatial analytics and big data mining. And two gentlemen that I'm here with today, so Henrikki Tenkanen and Olle Järv, are part of our group and represent maybe the data mining perspective in this work. Within the lab, what we have been doing is indeed that we've been studying human accessibility and mobility in different scales from global to local, using, for example, mobile phone data, different various data sources, and now recently social media data as well. And then there's a different sort of part which is very tightly combined to the human mobility part related to conservation science. And we've been doing, for example, conservation prioritization exercises a lot. Atte Moilanen, who's a conservation scientist with a lot of development with the zonation software, for example, and conservation prioritization, has now joined from the beginning of this year our group as well. Part-time he's elsewhere, and that development is ongoing. But of course, if we think about the priority areas, for example, for biodiversity, wherever globally or more locally, so most of those are somehow affected by humans. And how they are affected by humans and what is happening actually in those areas that are somehow important for biodiversity conservation is a bit difficult to map, as we all know. And that is somehow something that we've tried to be analyzing, combining the knowledge that we've been developing in different environments to natural environment analysis. And of course, all of this aims to, well, broadly, to be somehow trying to solve the worldwide problems of global change, the biodiversity crisis, more than anything. with the idea that if we somehow are able to understand human behavior better in relation to natural areas, to understand the threats that people pose, and to understand also the opportunities that people's interest to nature creates, so then of course we are better off in doing conservation work, as you all know. And the idea of our work is somehow to be sort of providing data, providing understanding that is spatially explicit and in-depth to understand the threat patterns, what is ongoing in the world, and then the opportunities that there is for conservation from education, from economy that visitors bring to protected areas, for example, and so on, and how we could be analyzing this using novel data sources. The challenge is huge, of course, as we all know, thinking about only the protected areas that are protected at the moment. This is only IUCN categories 1 to 6 globally, but there are so many, more than 200,000 protected areas in the world, and understanding that what is happening in those areas is of course a huge challenge, and there's different types of activities in this house as well, not only mapping these but also doing, for example, the observatory for protected areas, and social media data potentially could be providing one source of additional data covering global areas and available globally in a similar manner. And this has been one of our hopes. If we think about how human activity is generally analyzed and information about human activity is being collected in relation to protected areas, in relation to natural areas, even in easily accessible places like urban parks, not to mention Amazonian lowlands that are difficult to reach. So then the ways have been quite challenging, especially if there's a wish to be getting broad coverages. And if we think about the ways, so traditional methods like interviews, in-depth interviews, or then surveys have been carried out extensively. Of course, there's recently a lot of activity in citizen science, so deliberate campaigns in order to be collecting information on people's activities and preferences and hopes for and values for green areas. But then mobile phone data and social media data, we believe, can provide also something interesting. And this is what we've been analyzing for the past few years. And with this sort of undertone of the worry that there is not enough understanding, not enough data available, that we should be somehow able to remotely sense people, as we are really good in remotely sensing the environment at the moment. So is there a way to be remotely sensing people, which sounds awful in a way, we don't want to go to that Big Brother type of thing at all, but as people are posting openly so much information, so whether that could be somehow of use. And if we think about how much data there is produced all the time by all of us, this captures only a small fraction of that. This is a graphic visualization that tries to be showing the data deluge, the avalanche of data, as some researchers say, that in 2017, every minute of the day, for example, people posted on Twitter 456,000 tweets every minute, and in Instagram, well, close to 50,000 Instagram posts. And then of course there's all other activities that people are doing online that are leaving a track, that are producing data that potentially could be somehow useful. Why I have highlighted these two from here is that those are the data sources that we have been trying to analyze, and particularly sort of concentrating on those data sets that have been freely posted, openly posted by people, not to be sort of going beyond any limits. Still, we are sort of in the borderline of human privacy as well when we analyze these data sources. So the idea has been to be trying to understand whether those data sources, Twitter, Instagram and FLICKR to start with, could be somehow useful. And then there are other interesting data sources, other social media platforms that people use in different parts of the world that work in a similar manner, and the same methodologies could be then used for those as well. And if we think about what a social media post is actually like, so usually when we talk about big data, it's often of course said that big data is messy and difficult to be somehow structuring. It's unstructured, it's sort of full of all sorts of things that are difficult to analyze in a meaningful manner. But then if we think about, for example, the Twitter and Instagram and FLICKR posts, so they are fairly structured in the end. They are fairly like approachable when we try to look at that, what do they actually contain. So if there's a post in Instagram, like Henrikkiin here in Finnish Lapland in National Park, so that has of course different bits. So there's a geotag quite often, so people are tagging their photos roughly, nobody knows because all of these social media platforms are private companies, so we don't really know what is actually happening in there, and that is one of the research challenges of course. But still, we know roughly that 1% of all the social media posts in Instagram, for example, are geotagged. And in Twitter, yes, it's the same. Well, in Instagram it's higher, I believe. In Twitter it has been analyzed to roughly 1%. So 1% of that, how much was it? 450,000 per minute has a geolocation. And then there's usually or always some information about user. There's potentially an image that has its contents, whatever it is. There's text usually that people write. Might have emojis, might have hashtags, or then just free text. There's a timestamp when the post has been sent out, whether it's in immediate action or whether it's something that people do later on after being in a place. We don't know, or it's difficult to say. But usually, in some platforms at least, people post immediately, like in Instagram. And then there's a section of likes and comments. We know who has been liking posts, if they have been retweeting or if they have been sharing them. So somehow we also see a network behind these individual posts and connections between people. And that is actually not so messy and unstructured anymore, even if the content is sometimes that. And what we've tried to do somehow is then to be analyzing that in the context of green areas, and in the context of national parks especially, they have been in a way our lab. So what we can be learning from these data and these different pieces of information that there is in social media posts. So can we see something about people in natural areas based on geotags, timestamps, contents and user profiles? And we've somehow sort of thought that yes, we can. And on the sort of from a geographer's perspective, the classic question is that where people are and when they are in a place. And these are something that have been maybe most analyzed using social media data. I'll show you examples later on. But then, interestingly, with social media data content, we can also try to understand that who those people actually are. That go to a place, why they go to a place, what do they do in there, what are their preferences, their sentiments, and when do those occur and where, in which types of locations. And that comes only from the social media content that we already can be looking at those questions. And of course then if we combine data from various different sources, environmental data or other types of data about people's preferences, so then we can be getting an even enriched image of people in natural areas. Well, we've been doing publications about this during the past years, but the main idea has been to be using two different countries especially as sort of labs for the work. So we've concentrated this far mostly on Finland and South Africa, for the reason that we have in Finland 39 national parks and in South Africa 16 national parks. Due to our collaborators, we have good data sources collected in a traditional way. So In Finland, for example, in every national park, every 5 years there's a visitor survey being carried out, which is in-depth visitor survey where people are asked that what do they do and why do they come and how long they stay and in what kind of group and these kinds of things which are really important for the national park managers, both on the national level and then on the local level, to be somehow developing the activities. In both countries there's also visitor counting, which is quite accurate. So we have in Finland counters on the paths and elsewhere in the parks, and in South Africa usually the national parks are fenced and there are gates, or at least there is a gate, and you buy a ticket, you give your information, your nationality, how long are you staying, in which kind of group again, and so on. And those records we've had as a background information or as a comparison information from these two different countries. And the idea has been that when we have been collecting social media data as we have been, so using open application programming interfaces, we've been collecting data from these different platforms from the whole of the world. Full coverages, well, there are some temporal and some spatial holes in there, but in principle the idea has been to be collecting full coverage of the world from all the protected areas from or since 2014. So Instagram we have 2014 till 2016, and now the collection is started again. FLICKR we have extensively as well, and Twitter continuously. And we have a sort of infrastructure collecting these data sources so that we could be using them not only in these two countries but everywhere in the world if we like. And there are some global projects now ongoing where we take the understanding that we've thus far collected to more global scale. And as, I'm a bit repeating myself, but I think that it's important to say that as social media data analysis in different fields where it has been used for research purposes has been very sort of exploratory. People see that what comes out, like let's map who's drinking coffee and who's drinking tea in the United States, or these kinds of things. So then as we've tried to really understand something and really tried to be sort of critical on the data source as well, so then having this background information and the surveys and the visitor counts has been important for us, and that's thanks to the collaborators who we have, so Metsähallitus in Finland and South African National Parks in South Africa, that they've provided all the data that they have. And in Finland they've also included during the past 1.5 years in all of their visitor surveys part where they ask that how people are using social media in the national parks as well, so that we know roughly that what is the representativeness, if any, of social media posts in the national parks, and that is quite nice. But then if we have a look a bit that what have we then learned? But before going to that, I would like to ask you that have any of you been using social media for some purpose in your own research? Who has? Yes, what have you been doing?
We've been using FLICKR to look at recreational coral reefs around the world.
Recreational coral reefs, okay? That's super interesting. What about you? Yeah.
No, I just remember it's not really social media, it's more like social citizen science.
Okay, yeah.
Using citizen science data to map the spider distribution.
Okay. Yeah, which is very much linked, of course. Like all of these citizen science campaigns are very much linked to social media, but social media is completely like non-programmed what people post, which is a negative side to it somehow, but then there's a positive side that maybe it tells something which is more spontaneous reaction about the experiences that people, for example, have. Social media data or social media platforms could also be used, of course, for citizen science campaigns if one would be asking people to, for example, tweet with a certain hashtag, and then you could be collecting only those for your purposes. Yeah, but how we have been approaching the questions in the different corners of the Pentagon. So, for example, in where and when that is sort of an old question in a way, but still it hasn't been fully answered even yet. Wood and others published already 2013 an analysis based on FLICKR photos where they had visit accounts for cultural and natural touristic destinations and then counts of FLICKR posts from those places, and they were comparing them. Is there a correlation between the density of the posts and the popularity of the location? And yes, there is. And this is something that we've tested then later in national parks more in depth. Then Levin and others, for example, did really nice global analysis. 2015 it was published with the title that Where Have All the People Gone, where they combined nightlights data, which is often used as a surrogate of population density. It doesn't fully work, but it is still some sort of a surrogate for where people are, at least those with a lot of resources and potentially a lot of destruction power, if you will. And they compared nightlights and then social media post density and identified areas where there's no nightlights, so basically no permanent inhabitants. That was their interpretation. And still there's posts coming from social media, and they try to be understanding that what are those places where people go and visit for recreational purposes in natural areas. And in here, for example, the green areas are those where there's no nightlights but still a lot of social media posting. White is both, a lot of both, and then the pinkish is so that there's people according to nightlights but not social media activity. And with this analysis they wanted to show globally that which are places, which are popular destinations in terms of nature-based tourism, identifying places like Masai Mara and Serengeti, Ngorongoro, Grand Canyon, Yosemite. So no surprises in a way, but still quite nice analysis, especially as you can be quantifying that to some extent. What we've been doing in this respect in a paper led by Henrikki that came out just some months ago, we've been comparing the national parks both in Finland and in South Africa and the visitor counts and the popularity of the park in the first place. So whether social media activity tells about the popularity of an individual park and whether it can be telling about the temporal changes in the visitation pattern. And in both cases the answer is, based on Finland and South Africa, yes and no. So overall, yes. So quite well, social media in 3 different platforms that we compared seems to be telling about the popularity and the temporal patterns. But then there are places when it doesn't really work. And then we've been with stakeholders in those different areas, we've been trying to understand that what are the reasons. And in that paper we try to be opening up also that in which cases it doesn't really work very well. But the overall assumption is that in popular parks, in popular green areas, social media activity fairly well tells about the temporal and the spatial patterns of people according to these comparisons. Even going to fairly detailed level, so this is from Kruger National Park in South Africa, where half of our team is at the moment participating in Savannah Science meeting. And we've been studying that more extensively over the years. And in there, for example, when we attach the social media postings to road network, we can identify those areas which are not maybe popular as roads, but popular in the sense that there is a lot of human-nature interaction. So there is both people and something to see, so that people are posting from those locations. And this is, of course, again, something which the managers have been quite happy to obtain, because otherwise there's no means of collecting this type of data in this spatial accuracy. In some national parks in Finland, we've made these comparisons as well. They are not included in my presentation, but where we have more detailed information about people's mobilities within the park. And again, like even within the park level, the pattern seems to be pretty matching. But what makes maybe interesting, or what makes it interesting to use social media for these types of analysis is that one can be, of course, tracing back also on people's mobility. So not only seeing that where they are at the moment, but seeing that where they have been earlier. For example, in South Africa, the national park managers have been very interested in seeing that what kind of combinations people want to make when visiting national parks. So what are sort of park baskets, as we call them? So if there are these very popular national parks like KRUGER or then Table Mountain and others, so do people visit both parks, or do they go also to small parks which are close by? What makes them go to a different place? And what this shows is just analysis of those people who have been visiting any of the South African national parks, and then an analysis that if they have been posting from several different parks something, so which are the combinations. And this shows, for example, that Table Mountain and KRUGER are highly connected. These are the connecting lines between those. So most people or many people go to those two, but then they don't necessarily go to small parks which might be even close by to those, because they want to be getting these like big experiences, visit Cape Town and visit savanna type of environment. And this is kind of information that no data collection on the gate of a national park can provide, or no visitor counter can provide, and hopefully help people to be then developing the parks. Also so that, for example, smaller parks could be appealing for people, they could be marketed, and then that some of the pressure could be taken away from most fragile places. Then of course people have different preferences depending on where they come from. They behave differently in parks, and also from the sort of nature-based marketing perspective, it's important to understand that where do people come from. When we've been comparing the statistics of the data that is collected from the visitors and what we see from social media, so again there is not a perfect correlation, but there is some connection, so that the most popular source countries, for example for Finnish national parks and KRUGER Park, which we've been analyzing, seem to be the same both in social media and in the actual data that we get from the officials. So we believe that we might to some extent be able to say that from where people come from by tracing back their posts and the different geotags that they provide. Yep. If we then think about the question when, I already touched upon that, but I'll still give an example of that as well. Wood and others in their 2013 paper made this kind of diagram, which was quite nice and inspiring for us, where they had been comparing the temporal activity of people in social media in 3 different national parks that are different in their use. So one had an event and huge uproar in a certain period of time and had a high peak in social media activity. And these are of course common when there's something special happening in some place. Then in places where there's, for example in this case, a Burning Man festival is organized in this national park, so that sort of repeating yearly pattern that people come to the park is also of course visible in the social media postings. So based on this, it can be believed that people are posting when they are in the park, and hence it could be used as a surrogate for people visiting the park. In the last one, the pattern looks more like all of our analysis areas, where, for example, seasonal changes make people come. So in Finland, for example, many of the parks are visited in summertime. Lappish parks in northern Finland are visited in wintertime for skiing, and so on. And this kind of yearly fluctuation of visitation rates is normal, and that in Wood and others paper was already shown as an example case from one park. In our case, we compared the 39 plus 16 parks with the different platforms, so Instagram, Twitter and FLICKR, and their combination. And we counted so-called user days. So if a person posts several posts per one day, then that person is counted only once. Otherwise, if he or she posts also on the following day, so then he or she is again counted as a new person, in order to make the measures comparable with the counters and the data that the officials provided us. And the end result is that indeed we see the similar trends in both data sources, the official records and social media data, but Instagram is like the one which is driving the results. Instagram works super well, whereas the others, Twitter and FLICKR that we now analyzed, don't really work so well, even if Wood and others were making their analysis on FLICKR. So at least in Finland and in South Africa, people use Instagram in a way that they post instantly, as the name tells, when they are there, and hence create data which is somehow representing being in the place, whereas the Twitter and FLICKR are then used a bit differently. So the results are somewhat reassuring that social media data could be providing something interesting. But maybe more interesting it becomes when we go to the top part of the Pentagon. So when we try to be understanding that who then are the people who are in a place and so on. And for the who question, what we've tried to do is to be, well, basically this is work in progress very strongly. So we've tried to be exploring different approaches that we could be using to understand that who are the people. One being, for example, language, in some places where language areas are small. So for example, this is now from Korea and Japan, and in those countries, the national parks that are in there. And what Vuokko Heikinheimo, who's a student, a PhD student in the project, so what she's been doing is to be identifying using automated language identifier languages. And for example, in Korea and in Japan, it seems that most of the posts are made in the national languages, indicating, of course, that the parks are visited mostly by the national visitors, because if I would go to Japan, I couldn't, even if I would like to post in Japanese. So there's a limitation, or if many of you would come to the Finnish parks, you wouldn't maybe still post in the Finnish language. So in areas like this, where language is somehow limited, we could be using language as some sort of an indicator. Of course, English is overwhelming in all social media platforms. Even from the central Helsinki, we see that most Finns post in English. So the language part is not very good. Then if we want to be understanding more something else about people, so then again, machine learning has been developing a lot to be recognizing faces, to be understanding, for example, based on the face. This is an algorithm which is available online, the gender. So there was me and Henrikke, and here is me and Enrico. And of course you see that my age, for example, changes quite not because of the company, I think, but just because of something. But the gender, let's go further. Here's a group of us in South Africa. So if we do this kind of analysis, we sort of instantly see that how many people in a group, how big, like if we have one post, so how many people have been there, in which kinds of groups people are, gender balance, and all of these go, except for this kid who's a boy. So that goes wrong. But otherwise, all of them go okay, and there's 10 years of sort of difference from the true ages of people, plus or minus, but still it goes sort of fairly well. And when we've been testing this with elderly people, with kids, so elderly people, kids, middle-aged, like us, kind of thing, so that comes fairly well out from these facial recognition algorithms that are there, like just to take for your analysis. And that's a bit scary, isn't it? But useful at the same time, hopefully. And then when this is combined, for example, to the mobilities, so this is now visitors of PALLAS-YLLÄS National Park, where globally they have been going. in which other places or from which other places they have been posting. So, of course, this starts to also tell, if analyzed more in detail, something about the visitor, like characteristics. So what kind of people are those who come, for example, to that national park? They go to Hawaii, they go to Japan, they go to New Zealand, and maybe they are searching for something special. And then when you look more carefully about individual, this is one person and his or her mobility patterns, so then already you can start to guess. Can you guess that what is sort of in common for the places that this person has been visiting? I don't know if you can see. Well, if you can't yet guess from the mobility patterns, so what is the sort of nice thing in social media data is that of course there is the content. And then you can dive deep into the content and see that what the person has been posting about. And this starts to be a bit revealing about the preferences of the person, that what was it that brought him or her potentially to PALLAS-YLLÄS National Park? What was he or she after? And that sort of brings in the two last corners and how we can be somehow understanding what and why people are doing in national parks. There's different approaches than this kind of approach on the content, automated content analysis. So, for example, Van Santen and others from the University of Amsterdam, they made a spatial analysis in a European scale in such a way that they just took all the posts that had a word landscape in there, in any European language, and they filtered those, and then they saw or analyzed that where are the clusters of those locations, and made a model using environmental variables in order to understand that which environmental variables seem to be triggering landscape appreciation. In this case, that's how it was interpreted, that if people post a post about landscape with that term, so then they have been somehow appreciating that landscape, and then they were able to explain variables like accessibility, population density, income, mountainous terrain, and proximity to water explained a significant proportion of observations. So in addition to the facts that relate to the use of social media data, which might be income, for example, and other things, or people being in a certain place, like accessibility and population density, so then mountainous terrain and proximity to water trigger these posts. We've been making a similar analysis from Sub-Saharan Africa, seeing, for example, that the presence of charismatic species in Sub-Saharan national parks do not explain the social media activity. There's other things like openness of the landscape, which makes people post more. So it's not that you would need to have charismatic species for people to be interested in an area. That's one interpretation of that. Well, then we've been analyzing, in addition to this, for example, that can we understand activities, what people do in a park. The message from this image from one of the papers from the northern Finland, from this PALLAS-YLLÄS park, is maybe that the most popular activities that are identified in the surveys and questionnaires that people are making, so those are appearing also in social media posting. But then there are other activities which are not even asked from people and that are appearing, like emerging activities like winter biking, which is a new trend in there, or kite surfing, or things that haven't been even known to ask, and people are doing those kinds of things in there, and social media reveals that to some extent. Then if we analyze, for example, the preferences of people, again comparing the survey and social media post, the work by Anna Hausman. So there we see in South Africa, for example, that people are posting a lot about the things that they say that they would like to see. For example, if we go to the species level in these charismatic species, so the ones that people have hoped to see, so they are the ones that are the most posted about as well, except for the dreams that don't come true, like cheetah, leopard, and African wild dog. that people really said that they wanted to see, but there's no postings about them, and we can all think that why that is the case, that they are so difficult to find, and even if you would find them, they might be difficult to take a photo of because it might be a quick visit of the species. So this sort of tells not the same story, but the difference in these two stories is actually quite interesting. Well, how we've been doing this work in terms of the content analysis mostly this far is with this method. So even if I've been sort of talking about artificial intelligence here, so we've had students and we've had Coke and we've had pizza in order to be classifying a lot of photos and to get the content out. That is needed in order to be able to train any machine learning tool for the later work. And now we are in a phase developing still and sort of searching for different options that how we then could be applying the advanced machine learning approaches to be studying, for example, activities. Here's an example. Tuomo Hiippala, who has been doing this most in our group, has been doing these classifications. So for example, in a photo like this, with the normal, again, like from the shelf, packages, you can be classifying an image and verbalizing the image content so that it's easier to be analyzed later on. Woman riding a bike, trees on a hill, trees with green leaves, and so on. And this is fairly advanced at the moment, so if we have photos like this and we want to, for example, see that what are the objects in there, so there's a person, there's a person, there's a person as well, then car, and so on. And we can be counting objects and seeing what is in there for real. And of course, if we would like to do any of the analysis that we've shown now about the why and who and so on, for broader amount of national parks than just the two countries. This is what we definitely need because we don't have enough Coke and pizza for to be collecting that data. Then also, for example, automatic sentiment detection has been advancing really a lot. We are a bit cautious about the possibility of using sentiment analysis, at least in the park context, for the reason that people are so overwhelmingly happy in their posts in national parks. And still we would like to understand that do people experience more happiness in national parks, for example, than they do elsewhere? Because that is one of the reasons which in Finland, for example, is sort of out loud said to be the reason to be maintaining national parks, the mental health benefits. But this is difficult to analyze in that context, but we are trying now another case where it could be used very well in conservation science is, of course, that when there is a conservation action which is being made or something negative which is happening, so then what are the sentiments of people in relation to those events? And then if automated sentiment analysis is somehow functional, so then one could be understanding that what are the positives and negatives, and for example, what is their spatial distribution, where people are upset about something. Like Cecil the lion, Enrico and some of his group members have been analyzing, or his project people have been analyzing these things, and it seems, for example, that many of these African uproars that were very strong in here, in Europe and in the US, didn't have much sort of influence on people's daily activities on social media in the sight of the happening. So and that seems to be the case, that also analyzing not only the sentiment but analyzing the spatial distribution of the sentiment is quite important to understand that what people are actually thinking and who are the people who are thinking in a certain way. Well, I hope that these examples gave you some sort of an idea about our considerations and ongoing work at the moment on these few corners of the complexity of people in natural areas. There are a few sort of disclaimers that I would like to make, because we are quite sort of enthusiastic about this, but at the same time sort of recognizing many of the problems that there are. So first of all, of course, not everyone is using social media data. We've been analyzing that in the national parks that we've been studying, and for example in KRUGER we know that 80% of the tourists are members of some social media platforms, but most of them are members of Facebook, which is quite difficult to be mining. We know that 74% share their nature-based experiences in social media in some of these platforms. But then again, the other analysis of where and why, for example, reveal that still, even if we are not capturing everyone, still the overall broad patterns are visible both in the surveys, which are made so that they are representative, and then in social media, where representativeness cannot be controlled. Women tend to be more posting and than men, and of course young people are overly represented. Then another sort of disclaimer type of thing is that platforms are used in a different way, and there are many others than the ones that we have been analyzing. They are biased in geographical coverage, they are biased in people who are using them, but then they are biased also in a way how they are being used. So, for example, Instagram is used for sharing the instant experience. FLICKR is much more used to share a detail, like a species information, or something which is more sometimes scientific in its nature. So professional photographers, for example, tend to be using FLICKR, and that data is very interesting for that reason, for many purposes. For example, when analyzing species. And then Twitter is more on discussion, feelings and participation also from outside of an area where people, like outside a national park, so people comment on matters related to the park even if not being there. Then in technical terms, a lot of pre-processing is needed, so it's not even if we had a nice figure that we take from API the data and then we get the map out. So actually there's a lot of cleaning and other things that need to be done in order to get meaningful data out. And then if we would like to be searching for something specific, like we have a project on illegal wildlife trade and few papers coming out just now on that, and how social media data could be used in that. That's a Enrico's project. So finding rhino, for example, from the extensive mass of data is really difficult and requires a lot of work and filtering in order to get that out. So somehow to conclude, so how we now feel that there are several challenges in the future if social media data is somehow to be used more seriously still in conservation practice and also in conservation science. And there are problems like dependency on the commercial platforms at the moment, but that can't be controlled. It's more a possibility than a problem still. Then we need to be thinking how to be ethical, how can we do our work openly and still respecting people's privacy, and then what methods and how we should be applying them in order to do meaningful work for conservation science. But even if there are some things to develop and worries, so still we are as excited as we were in the beginning, or even more at this point after 2 years plus of working. So social media data is global data in the end. The same approaches to be mining it apply in all parts of the world, in comparison to, for example, mobile phone data that we have been using extensively from Estonia and to some extent now starting to use in Finland, which is really good and accurate data in many terms. It's really difficult to negotiate. Social media is available similarly from everywhere if people are posting it. It's spontaneously generated, which is good. Sometimes spatial accuracy and temporal accuracy are quite good, plus the contextual content or the contextual part provides really meat to the bones when analyzing it. And at the moment the methods are very rapidly developing, so it requires following up on what is happening in computer science, of course, in order to be applying the recent methods. But otherwise, there's a lot of promise in automated analysis of these data sources. But still, we would like to be somehow emphasizing the importance of triangulation and ground truthing of the results. And with the idea that these questions at least could be answered. Where and when people go to natural areas, who are they, why, and how do they use those areas, whether it's a threat or an opportunity for conservation, and how does it change over time, can of course also be analyzed. And maybe with that, I would like to thank everyone who has been particularly in our lab contributing to this work. So these are the people, and then maybe highlight 2 projects that are particularly working on these matters in green areas, and thank our founders and collaborators. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuuli, for a fascinating talk. Has anybody got any questions? We've got time for a couple before we go downstairs. Yep.
Thanks a lot, that was really interesting. And sorry, because I haven't used social data before, this might be very obvious for everybody else for this kind of purpose, but what is how easy is it to access the data? And presumably for certain, and how does it differ between Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram? And what is is this, I'm just going to ask about the ethics, but I think if I go into that, that's going to be an answer for how to. But
Yeah.
basically how easy to access it, what are the restrictions?
Well, Facebook is really difficult to access, so we haven't been using that really.
Only the presumably only open access.
Yeah, we've been using only open access and only those posts that people openly post. So we haven't been going to any private accounts or anything like that. For FLICKR and Twitter, it's easy at the moment. Instagram was closed in 2015, was it? 16. So the API was closed, but now we found a way to go around, so that's accessible again. But maybe do you, Henka, want to be somehow?
Yeah. Well, basically, what you need to do for accessing. So the answer is that there is no easy way to do it, so that you have a software that you can download and do it. So basically, what we do is that we use Python programming to basically make requests to the API of different platforms, and we collect those and put them into the database. So it requires a bit of kind of work in programming, and they are different. They the basic idea of how they are collected differs in different platforms. So for example, Twitter is what we have collected is this kind of stream. So Twitter pushes all the time data to us, and then we just push it to our database and kind of collect it in that way. But for example, Instagram and FLICKR are such platforms that you basically need to make requests, say that I want to collect data from this location at this time, and then you can basically do those. But the benefit of those is that you can go back in time, whereas in Twitter, if you don't collect the data when they feed it, you won't get it basically at any time. So they have really limited possibilities to actually fetch the history. So it goes back 14 days, but that's it basically what you can do.
So that's why we are collecting continuously Twitter, because you can't go back.
Yeah.
And with the other ones, you need to have we have this kind of like a fishnet or grid of centroid points over the globe, and then we move from one centroid to the next one and collect from here, then here, because you can't collect the whole globe or the national parks, but only around the centroid, and hence you need to have a point pattern to collect it with.
A couple of data sets you didn't mention, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about them. One is TripAdvisor, which obviously is less geographically specific, but has a lot of political text. The other is the very new one of Strava, where we can see where people are walking and running and swimming and cycling and so on.
Yeah.
But you've started thinking about using that.
TripAdvisor we haven't been using. Strava we've been analyzing quite a bit in urban context, and in for example in urban parks it works, at least according to our understanding, better, and it can be revealing popular routes and so on, but it lacks of course the sort of content part, but provides detailed route information. There the data is quite biased again, so Strava is provided at least in Finland, and I think that it applies in many other countries as well. So primarily by male sort of fit male young males. So when we've been comparing, for example, biking speeds from different data sources, so Strava biking speeds are like 10 kilometers higher than in other data sources for the reason that they are like different people. So then again, like if drawing conclusions, for example, in the development of car for bikers, based on that data, so you might go somehow wrong because it's biased, but still there is opportunity together, like bringing these different data sources together has a huge opportunity. And then the mobile phone data is very intriguing because that has a full, like at least in our society, and I guess that in here as well, so everyone uses a mobile phone. So it's like the representativeness is like 100% of the population, if not the 2-year-olds. They don't have maybe, but still. So that provides in that sense very sort of comprehensive.
I can say a comment about the TripAdvisor, so that's definitely a nice data source, but the problem with that is that they kind of limit quite heavily the access to the data. So I have applied for getting access to TripAdvisor, but they never replied anything, so that's kind of the problem. And they have really strict kind of regulation, like what kind of, you need to be some kind of company to be able to do that. You need tourism and so on. So
Have you been using?
I've played with TripAdvisor a bit. We did scrape TripAdvisor for looking at mangrove forest.
oh yeah, scraping
Which got us some information. It was very interesting, but I need to write it up.
Yeah. Scraping, like I think that TripAdvisor specifically has forbidden scraping from their web pages. So it
Yeah,
like
but interestingly, I spoke to I eventually got through to someone from TripAdvisor who was very helpful and has basically said, yeah, you're fine, we can do it. Do you want us to help you? So,
okay.
and if you make that connection eventually, then
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's
Well,
good.
well, because that's in. I think it's written in the rules that you can't scrape. So you can't.
they sound very good.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you say a bit more about the rhino work?
What?
You mentioned a project you're working on with rhinos.
Rhinos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are you doing there?
Yes. So what is going on in there is that we have rhino killing data from KRUGER National Park, and the idea is to be comparing a bit that how the social media and then the poaching activities go hand in hand, or do they?
So you're looking for posts from the poachers or looking for posts from the tourists who are seeing poaching evidence or activity?
Yeah, looking from the posts by tourists, because of course there's a problem in a way that people, even if there's been given sort of direct advice for people not to post about geolocated, post about rhinos, so still people do. So whether there could be any connection on, like, we can do this, but also of course clever poachers can do this as well. So we are using just open data, and we still get rhinos out quite a bit. So then if somebody would be interested in following up on where rhinos are, or not even going to any APIs, but just sort of following the feed on KRUGER sightings, for example, and seeing that, okay, these guys have seen a rhino in there, let's go there at night, kind of setting. So whether that could be somehow visible in the data is something that we are looking at.
It's also about kind of mapping the supply and demand for those kind of products. So if we can see a photo of rhino horn somewhere, posted in well, maybe in Asia or somewhere, so kind of using those kind of photos to map the network.
And the flow of the product, is that possible, like, or with the pangolin or with some other sort of recognizable species, whether from the textual content or whether from the image content, any parts of the species can be traced. And this is part of the illegal wildlife trade project, which there's a lot of promise, and then there's a lot of sort of challenges, of course, as well, in order to get to illegal activities via open social media data. So that requires a bit of analysis.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for here now, but do feel free to come down to the common room and join Tuuli for a coffee where we can continue discussions in a minute. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Tuuli, for your wonderful, very fascinating presentation.
Thank you.